I wanted to do another painting video in this series I call Painting Discourse. And the last video I did, I focused more on the technicalities of what I was doing. I was fixing up an older painting. This video, I don't really want to focus on this painting that I did, I think, wow, way back in like 2019 when I first had the idea of recording my own artwork. I don't want to really focus on that. I want to focus on cultural analysis or this notion of stuck culture. I will probably explain a lot about the painting as I'm going along, but I wanted to really sort of do the, I don't know what you would call it, these sort of like TikTok Zoomer brain rot where you're trying to talk about something more meaningful, but there's, AI Peter Griffin, or there's some kind of surfing game going on where you're jumping through the Minecraft cubes, or, back in my day, the streamers used to do CSGO surfing. But, anyways, so I wanted to do that type of video, and hopefully you enjoy. So, like, share, subscribe, click the bell. And if you want to support me further, me, Gio Penichetti, artist, writer, podcaster, you name it, go to patreon.com/Jenner Productions, and of course substack.com/Geo's Content Corner. Both are only $5 a month. This helps keep the Kino and Nectar flowing, helps keep the content renaissance alive. Now let's get to the video and commentary. So here I am doing a landscape painting of a roadside, or rather a place near a road. I think it's local to me. I forget. This was a few years ago. I had discovered, well, more than a few years ago, actually. I had discovered this video on a card in my like GoPro knockoff camera. And I figure, well, it's good footage, from start to finish. I have a lot of impasto uh, passages as well where I'm using the palette knife. And here you could see I'm just trying to gauge the basic roadmap, as I call it. If you've seen my YouTube shorts, the basic roadmap of the landscape, which is good. Uh, of course, like these marks, they'll get fudged later on, depending on what I feel like doing. So I wanted to talk today about this term called stuck culture. And it comes from, well, it comes from a writer I don't exactly, I'm not a big fan of, Paul Scholes, but nevertheless, this idea was sparked in me by one of my many deleted tweets on Twitter. Sorry, X, but I hate that design, that rebrand. To me, it will always be Twitter. Where I was talking about this, it was a quote tweeting this video of the Costco guys. It was one of these like internet nostalgia accounts. It was the viral video that made them famous, of we're the Costco guys, the ones that were endlessly memed on and replicated with AI. And it said it was only from 2024. And so I had this post that I deleted because it, got some traction and some criticism, where I said it's very funny how it's only from 2024, but it harkens back to an older form of culture. It harkens back specifically to what in my mind was the mid 2000s, the sort of like last breaths of reality television. And I said, and maybe I shouldn't have chosen these words, I said, where like mass culture, the culture industry takes some lower class freak and gives them their 50 minutes of fame, and you could sort of make fun of all their foibles. And I deleted it because then I saw some big, I don't know, doing this big a comic person who does these furry comics, uh, and is saying like, you're making fun of a son, you're making fun of a dad playing with his kids, like what's wrong with you, man? Like totally ignoring what I'm trying to do, because that's the problem, is that people confuse an analysis of culture with a direct attack on a person, thus making discourse a bit impossible at times. And to me, it harkens back to that older form of media right before the internet took over all of culture, that was predominated by reality television, even way before in the 80s and 90s, with what you would call the trash TV era, where you had people like Jerry Springer and Phil Donahue, where they would literally bring up people that were from, the lower classes, or people that had some foible or some quirk. Howard Stern with the Whack Pack, and they would exploit them. And it was exploitation. And then later on, you had this replicated on the internet with the lol cow. I wrote this essay on my Substack about the lol cow. Uh, I'm There's many things to write, but the early iterations of viral phenomenon on the internet was, especially when YouTube came about, it was, people like Numa Numa Guy, Tron Guy, Charlie Bit My Finger, Ray William Johnson, all of these people that were then brought on to mainstream television during the writer's strike with shows like Tosh.0 that had the foresight to realize, like, yes, our cultural moment is over and the internet is going to produce at lightning speeds people that are like objects of criticism, or like social sin eaters, if you will. And we're sort of over. Like, there's still reality television stars, but they've had to market themselves in such a different way because of the internet. So I deleted this tweet because I didn't want the hassle or whatever, because people don't get it. Again, because discourse is impossible when you're confusing things. But my point being in this deleted tweet was that we live in a time where we almost long for the trash TV or the slop of the past. We long for a form of apolitical innocence in culture. I was going to say eminence, but that's, well, maybe. Um, and we long for pure consumption that is unburdened by a social conscience on the left or the right. It's like those viral tweets. The one famous one that I mentioned in my forthcoming book was by Jack Posobiec about the Pizza Hut design. Now everything's like this gray box in fast food consumption. But the Pizza Hut design was iconic, and it was like when you were a kid, you went there and it was demarcated above the rest. But now there's no longer that significance. And so people want to bring it back. Same with the Cracker Barrel thing that happened recently, where they changed their design and people wanted it back. And of course, every form of nostalgia is branded as reactionary, so you can never escape the culture war. But my point being is that the Costco guys and other viral phenomenon is like a return to that age of like reality television, where I want to just make fun of someone, or I just want to embrace something, I just want to consume something without the burden of a greater cause. For example, a lot of Hollywood films that aren't just pure consumption, whether it be, Marvel Extended Universe or whatever, a lot of films that have a lot of intense discussion around them are what I call like discourse generating films, or discourse slop, if you will, where it's films just designed to provoke a social response, to provoke discourse. And it's what, I hate to say it, but certain directors, like, they have this tendency to create films for people that like to think that they're smarter than they are, right? And that's the whole point of the film, is just to generate discourse unto itself. And some of these films can be great or whatever. A lot of viral phenomenon during the 2010s, a lot of marketing campaigns were like this as well. You had like Oatly, you had Budweiser, Gillette, where these companies are willing to take like discourse and culture war slop essentially and just market it back to you. And the controversy is the thing, but people long for something that what people perceive as being before all of this, like pre 2010s mainstream culture, or culture that was largely generated by the culture industry. Whereas culture generated on the internet, even in terms of just stupid viral phenomenon or lol cows or whatever, they have like the burden of creation. They burden us with them being auto generated. They're autopoetic. They come from the internet. And yes, a lot of it can be controlled. A lot of it can be a thinly disguised ad campaign by some big marketing firm or big corporation. But a lot of the organic stuff that happens on the internet places the consumer in the role of creator now. Even what I'm doing here with just a simple landscape painting, it's like an artist no longer is just an artist. An artist is a content creator. An artist has to become a self contained unit, a universe unto oneself. Whereas back in the day, the galleryist, the critic, there was a whole multitude of people that were there to ensure the artist did their job, and they sort of created discourse around the artist. So yeah, here I'm using my palette knife to create those little daubs of foliage, uh, going back to the painting. But now we live in a world where you're forced to do something else. You're forced to wear many hats. But in terms of this notion of stuck culture, a lot of it is driven by this need to, almost like a childlike need. And a lot of it comes from millennials who remember these cultural heydays. Remember like watching television when they came home from school, and I remember like watching the Steve Wilkos show when I came home from school. And a lot of the early internet phenomenon was driven by the digital natives of older and younger millennials and now Zoomers. And so there's this need for culture to harken back, because everything can have the possibility of coming back, quote unquote, to quote the late great philosopher Mark Fisher, where everything can come back. And so if nothing new is created, or rather what is new, quote unquote, is something that is very spiritually alien to most people, then even the slop consumption of old can be brought back with new eyes and with a sort of weird reverie, if you, I don't know how to pronounce it, a weird reverie, a weird nostalgic gaze. And I think that's ultimately destructive for culture. And I get the human impulse towards that, but there just is something off about it, because there are a lot of things that are good that are created nowadays. But if nothing truly new or unique is meant to grow in this environment, then what was perceived as the greatness of even the recent past can come back into existence. And I'm certainly guilty of this. I'm a terminally nostalgia ridden millennial myself. But, and I understand the argument that a fetishism over the new is something that should also be avoided as another extreme. But what I mean by new is what I mean by something that is unique to the people in our culture nowadays. And I think that we're not getting a lot of that. So going back to the painting, here I'm just fixing up the rocks on the side of the road. I'm trying to create a delineation with scraping away those thick layers of paint. And hope you've been enjoying this so far. And here I'm just trying to blend in together the different colors. I think if I recall at the time, I overworked it a little bit too much. But yeah, you use even the palette knife can be used as a blending tool. This great YouTuber, painter, fellow landscape painter in Australia called Richard Musgrave Evans, where he just paints with huge palette knives. And he doesn't use any mediums, he doesn't use any solvents. He essentially uses these huge mountains of oil paint on his giant palette, and he scrapes in to the background and foreground all the various details out in the Australian outback. And a lot of these canvases are huge for plein air work. I don't know, he's got the fitness and the fortitude to do it. But another aspect I wanted to discuss was a lot of the causes of stuck culture. I believe that was also highlighted in Scholas's work, but also elsewhere, is that there is a nature to globalization that means you're always competing with other people's, or rather, other people's are on a sort of like cultural jet lag towards the culture that you grew up in. And so the reason why a lot of culture or a lot of cultural products that are created by huge media conglomerates, especially, and even in terms of viral content on the internet, is because you have a constant stream of people throughout the global south who are viewing and watching this. And so a lot of huge corporations are well aware of this. And so you have to create content that has a cross cultural value. And that translates into, unfortunately, a lack of sophistication in terms of what people consume or what people produce on the internet and elsewhere. Because, in a lot of ways, being an enclosed cultural ecosystem breeds a lot of uniqueness and creativity. Whereas you would figure, and again, this was sort of the promise of globalization in the end of history, you figure that being open to the cultures of the world would give us a greater depth, when in reality, it's only led to a massification of culture. It's led to homogenization. Because of why? Because of market share. And you may think that that's, I don't know, anti capitalist or socialistic thinking, but the truth is the truth. There's a lot of market incentives to ensure that there is nothing quote unquote new being created. And what is new that is being created can then be exported and marketed throughout the world and doesn't have the same weight or gravity that a self contained artistic, cultural, even spiritual system within a culture itself can produce. And a lot of people talk about this even with the globalization of the work of art, suffering the same fate as not just, viral internet phenomenon or mainstream movies or any sort of like culture of any kind that happens within the culture industry, but even within the work of art. I mean, there's a lot of works of art that can translate across the globe, even what I'm doing here right now with the landscape. But in terms of the look and feel and the light of that particular scene, can only by definition happen unless you're creating a completely fictitious landscape of your own creation, which is fine. That's a valid form of expression. But in terms of an actual place in the world, this landscape here can only be the product of where I'm from, Southern Ontario. Whereas Richard Musgrave Evans, he can, what the landscapes that he produces can only happen in the Australian outback, in the Billabong. Those types of colors, the temperature, the air, the location, the scenery, even the plant life, the flora and fauna, all of that is unique to that location. And I think that's something that we sort of often forget when it comes to the work of art, when it comes to landscape painting in particular, but even any form of art. There's a lot of paintings that may be influenced by another culture, such as these, for example, these paintings that were done in places like Colombia by European trained artists. They still look like Baroque or even Rococo works of art, but they have a different flair, a different flavor to them. The pigments they had access to were different. If they were mulling their own pigments based off the earth minerals and the various pigments that they had available to them, right to the models that they were using, the stylistic choices that they had that were influenced even by indigenous art that they were seeing. So even though you have a style that was trained and cultivated in another region of the world, export that to another place and it'll have a completely different flavor. So that's one example. And of course, I was referring to the Cusco School of Painting, which was largely in Peru and other places where they took the same techniques of European painters and they have a very unique flair to a lot of very common, especially Catholic religious motifs. Now, keep in mind that there's a lot of issues with Cusco painting, with any form of European art as it intersects with Indigenous art. But beyond those issues, it's a good demonstration that artistic practices across different cultures obviously change and blend in together. And I know all of the more current issues of cultural appropriation and all of that, bracketing that for a moment, right? I mean, that's a much larger topic that maybe I'll address at some time, although a lot of the criticism is kind of ridiculous. But I think, even contrary to what some people might think, I would say, I think, yeah, there's certainly issues with cultural appropriation. Um, but I think a lot of people make too much of it, even though I don't say that it's not totally real. But, anyways, the point being is that artistic styles and practices and culture itself can transform. But what we have, especially in the age of mass communication and constant digital information flows, the swarm, as the philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls it, the swarm of information and content and expression on the internet, um, that has the ability to homogenize more than create these. And yes, people do create interesting and newer forms of culture, but that's not the modus operandi of mass culture, and that is not what is incentivized. What is really incentivized is to lower everything into something that is common and base and vulgar, and not just vulgar in terms of like a moral judgment, but in terms of just taste. Because, there's a lot of things in the work of art that can be quite immoral or provocative or shocking or transgressive and iconoclastic, but still has a greater intellectual, and you could even say spiritual worth, even though they may be dangerous for most people, right? In literature, especially. So these issues are very complicated, and that's why we have this notion of stuck culture, where we even opine for things that were just the mass consumable trash of the past, but they give us new meaning. Because what we're left with nowadays is either harsh or alien or too complicated, or just something that is not worth it. It's just something to have meaningless discourse that goes nowhere over. And so another thing too is that the lolcow, like their predecessor within trash TV, that whole class element as well, to say like, here are these people, especially within the context of North America, here are these people, they look like you but they're not you, they're degrading themselves, and let's make fun of them, but also you are that thing. That's another thing, that's another very controversial element to it as well, right? Maybe it's a bit beyond the scope of this video. I could talk about it in a podcast episode on Content Minded, where I'm branching out into more culture and art and things of and art criticism and things of that nature, as well as philosophy, and yes, still politics. So, if you would want me to do a whole podcast on this notion of stuck culture, or even the notion of expanding that essay I did on the lolcow, on why we're so fascinated with the most lowly of people, why this form of cultural exploitation is so powerful, please, drop a comment uh, if you're interested in that. So let's round off the video here. I'm getting into some of the details. So I've done the foreground, the background. I'm just trying to hammer in, and you notice I've scraped in some of the foliage with the palette knife. Um, and this just reminds me that yes, there are forms of artistic expression and culture that do have a wide variance among different peoples. The landscape, to me, is something that is both a particularity to a location, as I was saying before, but also I hope that anyone can see this and appreciate it and like it for what it is. And that is something that is powerful. That's something that, to me, certain forms of art, certain forms of literature, like the landscape, will never go away. Thankfully, there's something that there is an eternal element to it that will carry on, even in the age of AI art and digital painting and so on and so forth. I still am not worried about those things because to me, real expression of location, of the places that you know the most. To quote Gustave Courbet, us landscape painters in France, we paint what we know, we paint what we see every day. And I actually am in the works. I'm planning a whole podcast episode on Gustave Courbet. Maybe I'll do a little bit of a video with my own work. Although I don't know, I would feel wrong because I would never want to compare my own painting to one of the true masters of French landscape painting, Gustave Courbet. But I'm definitely in the works of that podcast. So we're coming to the end of the video here where I'm just hammering in the details. And here you can see me signing my name. I sign my name differently now, but this was back then in 2019. And here I will show you some of the details. You can see a lot of the different layers of thick paint. Of course, this is all acrylic. And that's why I'm able to scrape away a lot of details and I'm able to do these studio paintings with acrylic because you can keep layering them. You can let the underpainting dry to where you're not going to blend a lot of the details, which is when I'm doing my plein air works in oil. You have to be wary of the little details. And so here are the thick passages of paint I'm zooming in on. And you could see I've scraped with a palette knife. And here's my palette. I remembered to do that back in the day to capture my palette. And here we go. Here is the final reveal uh, of the white space, which is very good, where you could see the painting come alive when they have that nice, clean white border. So thank you so much. And like, share, subscribe, click the bell, and I will be back with more painting and with hopefully more streams on Digital Archipelago with my co-host Prudentialist. And I will be back soon with another episode of Content Minded. I have a number of different guests. One of them is quite a big guest, my good friend Kino Corner. So hopefully you enjoy this video and my numerous works to come.